I love him, Osrith murmured, her hands clasped in prayer, and the pressurized feeling that surrounded her suddenly died away. Whatever she had done, the Morrigan was satisfied. Now to the Christian God, her God and the saints, and Osrith ran through the Christian story in her mind, of Jesus' life and betrayal, his death and resurrection. She thought of how this teaching had reached Britain, first to the Irish, Cornish and Welsh, Hywel's people, and had crossed the sea with Comesill to Iona, and brought to the holy island of Lindisfarne by Aidan at the request of her ancestor, Oswald, King of Bernicia. How Augustine began a mission through which Edwin, Oswald's uncle, King of Dyria and mortal enemy, who was crowned at Ad Jeffrin, the ancient Briton hill fort not far from Bibbenberg, in the Cheviots, and was converted by St. Paulinus. How Edwin had been first to forge a Northumbria which reached from the Forth to the Humber, the biggest of the Heptasy named by Bede, and how Oswy, Osrith's direct ancestor, had to choose between the churches, the Irish of Oswald and the Augustine through Eanfled, his Kentish wife. Because St. Peter is the holder of the key to heaven, Oswy had concluded, I must defer to the Augustine, the Roman Church. But few hadn't, Alba certainly hadn't, and nor had many in Northumbria. That, and layers of other difference had caused the lines to be drawn to separate the tribes. But of all this, Osrith remembered, that she must be more like God, more giving, less impulsive. Let them dress her in, well, a dress tomorrow. Let them have the service as they wanted it. All Osrith wanted was her name and Finan's name recorded as being married in the Chaldees ledger, as had hers and Sainid's been. All could see, then, that she was his true wife, and he was her true husband. And, if Finan meant what he said, that she could return to Berwick, rather than be lodged with him as his wife in Bibbenberg, then she could be contented serving God by serving his people, as their lady. Osrith did not hear the chapel door open behind her, nor light footsteps cross the flagstones, nor the figure beside her. It was only when Constantine knelt beside her and folded his own hands in prayer that Osrith realized she was not alone. When he had finished his own prayers, Constantine got to his feet and held out a hand. Osrith took it, and he led her to the back of the chapel. Come, sit with me, he asked her. And Osrith realized he was wearing his crown, the bronze glittered in the dim candlelight, and his blue cloak, Domhnall's cloak. And suddenly, the weight of her time in Alba came to her senses like a wave on an angry sea. She had been beside Constantine for so long, beside Domhnall, and connected too dearly to Alba. It was no wonder that Finan had found highway to the king of Alba to discuss with him a marriage proposal. Do you wish to marry the Ullaid warrior? He asked her, his face sober, serious. I must ask, Osrith, it is not a demand being made on you? Osrith turned to him in amazement. No, she told him, indeed not. I do wish to marry Finan Uiken Chopper, and it is indeed my will to do so. After everything? After Doia. And this was the whiny Constantine, back again before her, not happy with a straight answer because it was not the answer he wanted. I did not know it was him. You may stay at the farm, Constantine interrupted her, holding up a hand. I understand you have grown attached to the people and they to you. It is good to have a prosperous land in my kingdom. Your kingdom, Osrith thought, and yes, when the tithes are sent, and I can overlook Bibbenberg's lands. You know, I believed you, and my other cousin. Constantine trailed off. Domhnall. Osrith nearly laughed, but then reminded herself that she did have a desire for him when she was much younger, and he was in exile for the first time, and he had become humbler. Where is he now? On his way to Arion, to aid Neil, Constantine told her. Then a formal look came to his eyes. But, no, he continued, shaking his head. The Kinchopar are cousins of my grandfather, of course. And he was enslaved, which I can now see has changed him. He is almost spiritual, if not godly. I have seen him pray, Osrith told him. He is godly. He wears Ethan's silver crucifix, which she hid when she was enslaved. At the name, Constantine flinched. At the time, Osrith did not think he knew about the enslavements. But maybe he did. Maybe he knew about Finolai. Perhaps he should give it back to Domhnall, to give him some peace. But Constantine did not pick at Osrith's accusatory suggestion. Domnall was not at peace, whatever anyone said to the contrary. And it was only then that she realized that she had not yet seen Domnall, usually the first at the guard gate. "I have one condition, on your marriage, on your management of the Berwick farmlands," Constantine told her. "You must remain as a spy to me, ride the country as I see fit, garner intelligence." It was only to be expected. Osrith knew she had been valuable over the years. But she had a condition of her own. "Constantine," she began, "you will not make me use my husband as a means of intelligence. My marriage will be just that, and you will not come between us." In the peace, in the quiet of the chapel, neither of them said anything else for a moment. There was no point in Constantine trying to wave off Osrith's assertion that he had been considering it, for they both knew that he had ego enough to assume she would do this. "When you have finished your prayers," Constantine told her, getting to his feet, "you are to be locked away, and called in the morning." And with that, the King of Alba swept out of the chapel, leaving Osrith alone. 88,888,888. And when Osrith had finished praying, she realized she had been in the place of worship since the afternoon before until sunrise on the day she was to be married. Hurrying across the courtyard, in the proto-light of day, aware that drunken singing was coming from the armory room, she took the steps two at a time, her weaponry in her hands. "Where have you been?" asked a tired Edra, who had slept in her own bed, and young Finan in his, having dropped off waiting for Osrith to return. "In prayer," she told Edra, weakly. "All night?" the young woman asked. "Never mind now, Elasade has made you a dress." Her tone suggested she was waiting for Osrith to express her gratitude. "And some water," she added. "I am grateful," Osrith told her, looking at the undyed cloth that had been used to make it. No embroidery, no fanciness. It was perfect, and Osrith knew she would be able to strap on buoy and tagged Sikhs, and Herstjan. "I thought you might have gone back to Berwick, and changed your mind." Edra's tone sounded a little hopeful. "No," Osrith told her, then yawned. "Sleep," Edra encouraged, taking on the mothering role, and fussing Osrith as if she were the errant child staying out all night. "We will leave you now. Athair will come for you and take you to your marriage," she told Osrith, matter-of-factly. "Where are we going?" grumbled young Finan, resister of an early morning rise. "To Elasade's spare room, where we should have been last night," Edra told him. Young Finan blinked and then jumped onto his bed, reaching up for Osrith. She let him jump into her arms and cuddle her. "You will be married again," young Finan told her, and Osrith nodded, kissing him on the forehead. "Oh, before I go," young Edra told her mother, "let me at least neaten your hair." She used a comb which she got out of the drawer of the table near the window. Once, it held binding cloths and strips to use around young Finan's bottom end when he was first born. Now Edra was using it for her own bits and pieces, and she glimpsed more ribbon, and what looked like a string of pearls. "Mat hair," Edra scolded, when she found a section much shorter than the other, and combed through her hair again, over the straggly parts, tying it at the nape of her neck with a ribbon. Osrith did not exactly cut it herself, but did lop bits off when Throi were in the way, especially in battle. And then, when door was closed, and she heard the key turn in the lock, Osrith lay down on the bed and closed her eyes. 88,888,888. Constantine dismissed Dubkin and Selark, who had volunteered to guard Osrith for the night, when he had got to the top of the stone steps and relieved his son of the key. When he knew they were at the bottom of the tower, the King of Alba unlocked the door and entered. How long had he come here? How many times? When she was locked away in confinement after the birth of their son, nothing anyone could say would make him admit it in his own mind that young Finan was his own, and he had climbed the outside of the tower to see her. She was asleep now, dressed in the garment Elasade had made for her, and Constantine stood at her bedside, looking over her body as it moved gently as she breathed. He loved the shape of her, how she had developed from a body that was straight up and down, to curves at the hips, and of course, bigger tits. He liked finding out the responses he got when holding her breasts, especially her nipples, which caused her to writhe on top of him, bringing him on. But that was nothing to when he had discovered the bumps in her cunt, and how to rub them. That was what he used when he wanted to get her quickly in the mood. Rarely, Osrith would resist, but he had grown much stronger than her, and she never resisted long. He would think about her body later, Constantine thought, and the pleasures he had had from it when he had taken her. But he had had her, he thought, bitterly, the allayed bastard she had discovered at the side of her brother. Constantine had nodded to the allayed bastard that evening, and let Angus slip out that Osrith had spent the night praying in the chapel. Osrith was not, as a rule, religious, so it might well have got him worried. But he seemed none the worse for a drinking session organized by Eswi at the alehouse where Constantine knew that Osrith had gone when she had married Sainid. He had seen the man, in clean breeches, shirt and jacket, even new boots. However had Eswi managed it? Yet, it was for Osrith, and if she needed him so she could stay at Berwick, then it would have to do. He could always have him run through, or his throat cut in his sleep if he got too angry about the thought of his cock inside her. Constantine nudged her awake. Your intended is waiting for you, he told her, and waited for Osrith to get to her feet, wash her hands and face, and then fasten her ironwear around herself. A true warrior lady. I call the Lady Osrith to her wedding, Constantine called, from out of the window. From the courtyard, a cheer went up, and he led the way out of the tower and down, becoming the beginning of the procession that was filled by the castle's occupants, following them to the chapel. At the altar, Finan stood, and beside him, Eswi. He was dressed in a clean set of warrior clothes which Eswi had, no doubt, found for him. But Osrith did not care about that at all. Never in her mind, after everything they had been through, did she ever believe she and Finan would marry. Even if they had, and Osrith had accepted a position in Utad's household, as all wives did, it would be impossible. The animosity between her and her brother. I bind your hands as a sign of your union, the priest told them, first in Gaelish and then in English. And that was all that Osrith remembered, until she was sitting beside Finan in the hall, and music was beginning on the pipes, and people were dancing, and singing. Then, they left, and returned to Osrith's room, being first greeted by Edra and young Finan, who kissed his mother copiously, but withdrew from Finan, only to bow his head to his father after urges from both Osrith and Edra. Osrith took the key, for she had extracted a promise from Eswi, lubricated with a bag of silver for the warriors to continue their celebrations with him at the alehouse, that there would be no bedding ceremony. When at last they were together, Osrith sat on the side of the bed, Finan next to her. Sometimes, just thinking about the day you and would marry, would get me through a bad day, he told Osrith, and then they waited no longer. Finan of the Ullaid, and Osrith, once Lackland, were married. 88,888,888 below, in the courtyard, a man was admitted in through the gates. He saw the merriment, and the warriors in full intoxication, and his king outside, standing on the cobbles, looking up at the tower. He turned to look at the man. It was Domnall. I could not get past the rocks at Fort Riu, he told Constantine. After sending half his ships back with the wounded, Domnall had taken the other half of the Alba Navy to respond to the call for aid that Don Shada Macflan had made in a letter to Constantine. Norse pirates. It was as if it were planned, and we were being ambushed. Domnall hung his head a little, and then looked at the hall. What's this? He asked. Come, Constantine told him. Unless you are in need of immediate refreshment and rest. Domnall shook his head, and instead, accompanied Constantine away from the hall and the tower, and to the battlements. What are we doing? Domnall asked him, as they walked on Dunnotter's walls. Keeping me away from the tower, he told his cousin. Domnall looked back towards it. A light shone in Edra's and Finenbig's room. Why? You will stop me from killing the Ullaid bastard, and taking Osrith myself. Domnall stopped walking. And then Constantine told him about Finan coming to ask for Osrith's hand, and getting her back from Berwick, and then their wedding. How did you leave it with Neil? Constantine asked, keen to change the subject. A reprieve. Domnall told him. We intercepted a letter meant for you, I thought we might be able to cut down the locks and cross country there, end up at the Western Isles, somehow. But it was not to be. There has been few attacks. Neil has gone down up to Don Chada to discuss a strategy. With your permission, I will make a fresh attempt to reach Irian, cross by foot to Glashku, for instance, and commission ships from Diffenwell. There are many build on the Clyde. You have it, Constantine told him. Take who we can spare. He shook his head. Don Chada would do well to follow his father's strategy. No mercy and absolute control. It is the only way the Norse will spot weakness. Yet they know you caught Anlaf Guthfrithson, Domhnall added. Anlaf was busy coordinating the attacks on the Irish. It could never have been hidden, despite the men we send west, the skill of Owain, thanks to Angus and Felim's hard work. Constantine paused, and looked out to the landscape, looking east, to where Domhnall's Kingstone had been placed, at Stirling, and cast his eyes further west still. Diffenwell is vulnerable. Dulriah too is vulnerable, as are all the islands and inlets. Even the original settlers he allowed to inhabit the Western Isles are being targeted by new Norse invaders. 88,888,888 and after, when the castle had settled down, and dawn was only hours away, Finan stroked Osrith's hair. War, Finan had replied, when she asked what was next. It is the only logical thing that follows peace. It was a reply that Osrith had expected. And then the conversation turned to young Finan. He tells me he is interested in a kitchen maid who had caught his eye, Finan told her. He's 8. Osrith has protested. And as Gaelish sounding as your Pictish king, Finan had pointed out. He's your son, Osrith had said. But the look on Finan's face was enough for Osrith to know that there was no doubt in her husband's mind. Anedra? Finan kissed her lips, and it took several minutes to continue the conversation. Uhtred asks after her, and Osrith thought of her face. Edra because Dotta was as wise as her father and as beautiful as her mother, long copper-red hair spilling down her back, her pale skin almost white, and intense blue eyes. Osrith had pulled Thera from her home on the day of King Alfred's funeral, set on fire at revenge for her Danish heritage. Allah, the pagan healer, could not save her but birthed the little girl Edre who Osrith had suckled, leaving Wessex for Dunnottar, and Constantine. Osrith stroked Finan's chest, her heart racing again with her happiness at their marriage. How long was it that you knew who I was? Osrith asked, as dawn arrived. That I was the girl you and your brother had met on the beach. When you said you had been Constantine's companion before you left, Finan told her. He held her close, then kissed her. I would like to say it wasn't me, but it was, and I was a child, and I am sorry. It can't be undone. That helped me grow stronger. I would have just been Constantine's whore dead by now. I shouldn't wonder. Anedra? Uhtred would like to know. I think Constantine adopted her, or at least, kept her as I gave him silver for her. She reads at the monastery. He believes she will turn to God. And you believe? Finan prompted. Osrith sat up on her elbow. She will turn to her mother's gods. Constantine is blind to that child. He loves her more than his own children. And the conversation turned to the practical. They were married, yes. But what kind of life were they to have? Osrith was sworn to the king of Alba. Alba was sworn against Northumbria, and, by extension Uhtred. By further extension, then, to her own husband. Yet she was Lackland, she had no land of her own, though Constantine had told her she could continue with the farms at Berwick. Though they were married, Osrith and Finan had nothing which they could call their own. When you leave for Berwick, I will come with you. I am to be its lord, he told her. Osrith sat up, amazed. I never knew. He didn't tell you? Finan declared, giving a ha of laughter. Berwick is to be yours, Osrith, on the occasion of our marriage. You are to manage it, on the understanding I return to Uhtred, which was always the arrangement. Of course, Osrith told herself, feeling a fool at the end of it all. Another tie to Alba now, for if the land was hers, she was a lady of Alba, and by extension, Finan was a lord, a Morma. He could, technically, be called to fight for Constantine. You are laughing. What's funny? Finan asked. You are a Morma of Alba, Osrith told him, and waited for the implication to dawn. That, bastard!" Finan exclaimed, but then laughed, and pulled Osrith close. "But, if I am not in Alba, he cannot call me, nor if I am fulfilling my prior oath, to the Lord Utad, in Bibbenberg, which is very clearly in." Finan broke off. "Oh dear," he concluded, shaking his head. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear." He glanced to the window and then back to Osrith, shaking his head. What? Osrith knew what, but she wanted Finan to say it anyway. A gust of wind blew past the tower. "Utad is not going to like this one bit, after giving consent to marry you in the first place." Now, it was Osrith's turn to be shocked. "What?" Finan turned to look at her soon-to-be outraged face. "When I sought the king's permission to marry you, he said it was not a matter for him, and had I sought consent from your brother." "Consent? From Utad? As your liege lord, you mean, for permission to leave his service temporarily?" "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," Finan repeated slowly, and when Osrith did not reply, as she thought about Utad telling Finan he could marry her, he added briskly, "So, come on then, better get up and packed, if we are going to make it to our farm's hall tomorrow." And he whipped the covers off Osrith's naked body, examining all of her features carefully with a grin. Then, he pulled her close, and gave Osrith a knee-melting kiss. "I must return," Finan told her, after he had humped Osrith again, "to Utad after we have gone back to the farm." "It is good," Osrith told him. "I can farm, you can visit. Constantine is bringing Finan Beeg and Edra soon." "You do not expect me to stay?" Finan asked. "I would have liked you to stay, of course I would," Osrith told Finan, her husband, with a grin. "But I do not wish to have my brother at my threshold demanding I return you. It would frighten the livestock." 88,888,888. There was a commotion down in the courtyard, when Finan and Osrith put in an appearance. Two riders seemed to be vying with one another to see the king. From what Osrith could see, Constantine was nowhere in sight. Neither were any Mormers, save Finan, and he would not know where the king was. "I have come for the king," one rider, drenched in sweat, told the growing crowd. "King Diffenwell instructed me to put this into the king's hand myself, and I have been sailing for a week." The other man protested. He was short, with the long black hair of the Irish, and he recoiled a little when he saw Finan. "I have come from Irian, and, Care Iron, I can deal with this." A voice came from behind the crowd, which parted. Domhnall, weary-eyed and pale, looked to the man. He too noticed Osrith and Finan, and as he passed, he said, "Congratulations, Osrith," and took her forearm, giving it a brief squeeze in his hand. He then looked over to Finan, narrowing his eyes. "Olaid," he nodded. "Ailch," Finan replied. But Domhnall had not finished. "If you do anything that causes her harm, Olaid," Domhnall continued. It could have been the start of light-hearted humor, as sometimes happened in those circumstances, but Osrith saw steel in Domhnall's pale blue eyes. "She will not be far away, she will be in Berwick," Finan told him, "which is very close to Bibbenberg," Domhnall pointed out, his voice still low, but still threatening. "Then, I will give your brother Will something to fear." "Oh no," thought Osrith. "There's going to be swords drawn at this rate." But the call for their admiral got Domhnall's attention, and he moved to Erin and put an arm around his shoulder and moving him away towards the hall. "I still need to see King Constantine," demanded the first messenger. "Will someone go to find him?" "No need," came Constantine's voice. "What is the urgency?" And the man thrust the message directly into the king's hand. "An invasion into Strathclyde," the man declared. It was too great a number, but he was interrupted by a cry, a naked scream of anguish. Domhnall was staring at the other message. Osrith broke from Finan's embrace and hurried to him. He was too distressed to speak, and was still staring at the parchment. It read, "Dawn Raid, beginning Bread Month, attack by Norse at Dara. 9 kings dead." And it listed, amongst others, Neil Glundube and Don Shada MacFlan. "Dead," Domhnall managed, looking away from Osrith, and he strode away from the courtyard, his head low. "I failed them," he added, in a voice not low enough for Osrith to miss. She read the letter again, before taking it from the messenger's hand and striding over to Constantine. But he already had one in his own hand, the one from Diffenwell. Into the other, she placed the one from Irian, and read the one from Strathclyde. Treachery, Constantine declared, not looking at Osrith, not looking at anyone. And then he read the one from Ireland. Treachery. He shook his head. My people, I have to report some terrible news. Our kin, in Irian, are dead, killed by one to whom I thought was our ally. At the bottom, Osrith saw the final part of the message. The name of the leader who had organized the attack on Irian and killed so many nobles was the written. Anlaf Guthfrithson has killed not only the High King, Constantine told them, but the sub-kings, those of Ailch, of Volade, of Mike, of Leinster. He inhaled, and gained his composure, as Osrith heard a gasp from behind her. She looked, and saw Edra, her face growing pale. It could only be because she had heard Anlaf's name. And, of the tripartite alliance, which we took so much time and effort to broker, between Wessex and its vassal Mercia, Northumbria and Alba, it is broken. Edward of Wessex has invaded over the border of Cumbraland. He had declared himself overlord of Strathclyde and of York and over West Wales princes. Rex Anglo Lorum, Osrith thought, the words taking her back to a time and a place nearly 40 years before, to Alfred's Great Hall, and to the first time she had heard the title. It meant King of the Angles and the Saxons. Edward had achieved that, albeit with Aethelstan, his son, as Lord of Mercia. But now, he wanted more, much more. By invading Strathclyde, as well as Eothwick and Cymru, Hywel's newly created land, he was one more step towards it. Edward was declaring himself Rex Britannium, King of the island of Britain. So they would soon be at war, as Finan had told her would come. For the next kingdom after Strathclyde, in order to achieve Rex Britannium, Osrith reasoned, could only be Alba,